The idea of India or the idea of any civilization or country or a society is something that constantly evolves over time. It's not static. Every now and then you would see, due to political influences, intellectual, ideological influences, new ideas emerging and re emerging. In fact, so many times the old ideas, we see them getting reinserted in new forms. So that has been the case with India as well. And if you follow the political movements of the country, or just the general direction in which the country is heading, you would find there has been significant change in the last few years. One major change was once India got independence in 1947, and that was very much obvious, as Indians were eventually getting to decide their fates by themselves. But in the beginning of this century, and especially coming into 2021, you see very new ideas emerging, or in fact very old ideas getting asserted once again. So what are these ideas? What is this new idea of India? There is a book called A New Idea of India, and which specifically deals with this issue. And I'm going to be reading some of the passages from this book, and I'm sure you'll get some intellectual argument behind this movement and what's going on really. So let's start. The Vedas, the foundational texts of Dharma, created some 3 to 5 millennia ago, are filled with such skepticism that would gladden the heart of philosophers and physicists even today. The great physicist Erwin Schrödinger, writing in 1944, observed that the Upanishadic concept that Atman equals Brahman, or that personal self equals the omnipresent, all-comprehending, eternal self, was far from being blasphemous, and in fact represented the quintessence of the deepest insight into the happenings of the world in Indian philosophy. It is because of the skeptical tradition within the metaphysical aspects of what is now called Hinduism that even atheists and agnostics can be a part of the fold. Like other religions, hypocrisies and hierarchies exist in Indic religions as well, but they are primarily sociological, related to gender and caste, and less theological. This is not because there are no holy texts or doctrines, but because those texts and doctrines can be selectively followed. As Nassim Taleb expounded on the meaning of the word religion in his book Skin in the Game. For most Protestants, religion is belief that with neither aesthetics, pomp, nor law. Further east, for Buddhists, Shintoists, and Hindus, religion is practical and spiritual philosophy with a code of ethics. So when Hindus talk about the Hindu religion, they don't mean the same thing to a Pakistani as it would to a Hindu, and certainly something different for a Persian. Skepticism is an indispensable foundation of what is called science. The fundamental premise of scientific inquiry is that an unknown truth can be learned through iterative experimentation and exploration. A school of thought that is dogmatic cannot profess to be scientific. As physicist Richard Feynman said, science is belief in the ignorance of the experts. Applied to the spiritual sphere, a scientific religion would be one that can accept that its claims are wrong. Philosopher of science Karl Popper said much the same when he posited that for a theory to be scientific, it should be falsifiable. Popper also critiqued the historicist and teleological underpinnings of Marxist and Hegelian worldviews, that there were inexorable laws of historical destiny, all leading towards definite ends. In simple terms, the Indic worldview is more cynical than linear and is not entirely deterministic. Similarly, an economic system that imbibes such skepticism cannot, by definition, be centrally planned, for that would compare an omniscient, omnipotent body to allocate resources. In this sense, socialism is analogous with obscurantist faith, while liberal capitalism is analogous to a scientific religion. Also, skepticism and the intellectual humility that it engenders is required to cultivate genuine tolerance in a society, for it allows fellow human beings to accept mutual differences. This tolerance is also mediated through the mechanism of the social contract in the modern era of democratic nation states, where the views of one person or group cannot be forced on fellow individual citizens. Social diversity, too, is the product of skepticism. Only if individuals are allowed to be syncretically build upon, that is, add and subtract from traditions and practices without being required to dogmatically treat them as immutable rules, can diversity emerge within a group. This diversity is apparent and much celebrated in the land that is India, where the same festivals and rituals are celebrated in different ways by different communities and regions. Had the Hindu tradition been a dogmatic one, there would have been uniformity, not heterogeneity, in socio-cultural life. Hinduism will never have a pope, or a Vatican, or a final prophet, or an unalterable holy text, or the one true God. That is why the opposition from some groups to multiple interpretations of, say, the Ramayana is very unfortunate. India, under Jawaharlal Nehru and his successors, decided to pursue a development model partially inspired by Soviet Russia, with the state having a gargantuan participation in the economy. Under his leadership, Indian democracy came to be based upon the state brokering and negotiating settlements between groups of religions, castes, and languages, rather than guaranteeing equal rights and freedom to individual citizens. Inevitably, the state favored some groups over others, anointing itself as the referee. In both economic and social spheres, the Indian state exuded a certitude that chafed against the millennia-old pluralist and skeptical ethos of the society it sought to govern. But the governance philosophy was not limited only to certitude. It was selectively condescending as well. While Hindu personal laws were modernized, Muslim laws were not. Perhaps Nehru wanted to cultivate a committed voter base to support him as he pushed through his program of leftist economists. For despite being deservedly criticized, Nehru always understood why India was united. In 1961, for example, addressing the All India Congress Committee session, he said, "India has, for ages past, been a country of pilgrimages. All over the country you find these ancient places from Badrinath, Kedarnath and Amarnath, high up in the snowy Himalayas down to Kanyakumari in the south, and throughout the ages people have gone on pilgrimage from north to south and south to north and mixed with each other. For from the very beginning of history, the people of India always thought of themselves as people belonging to one great country. What has drawn our people from the south to the north and from north to the south in these great pilgrimages? What is the common thought that has made them travel from one region to another? It is the feeling of one country and one culture, and this feeling has bound us together. This sense of common urge and a common thought came to us hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. Ancient books have said that the land of Bharat is the land stretching from the Himalayas in the north to the southern seas. This conception of Bharat as one great land, which the people considered a holy land, has come down the ages and has joined us together. Even though we have had different political kingdoms and even though we may speak different languages, this silken bond will always keep us together in many ways. Throughout these thousands of years, this land has been ours, ours in mind, ours in heart, and ours in spiritual heritage. But Nehru's philosophy of centralization and certitude, carried forward with increasing intensity by successive members of the Nehru Gandhi dynasty, had disastrous consequences for economic development and communal harmony. Today, the fact that the Nehruvians are hard pressed to even acknowledge the civilizational unity that seemed obvious to Nehru himself shows how far they have traveled from their roots. In the quest to brand themselves secular and guided by narrow electoral interests, they have transformed into deniers of India's heritage. As the writer and MP Swapan Das Gupta noted in his book Awakening Bharat Mata. Till the lifetime of Indira Gandhi at least, the Congress, despite many secular adjustments, broadly represented the mainstream of Indian nationalism. However, as it progressively vacated the old ground and simultaneously lost its overwhelming political dominance, traditional Indian nationalism increasingly came to be identified with forces that had hitherto been on the fringes. The slow transition of Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata from being a mainstay of the Congress to being identified with the BJP epitomizes the shift. The fundamental flaw of modern India's secularism as practiced today is that it embodies a confusion between the state and the society. Nowhere is this confusion more evident in the way secularism and communalism are routinely hailed as antonyms. The opposite of secularism is not communalism but theocracy, for secularism is a feature of the state. Nation states can be secular or theocratic. Communalism is a feature of all societies. In a free, democratic, and liberal country, when people who share the same ideas build coalitions and alliances, it is not only acceptable but sometimes even welcome. It is precisely through the creation of non birth based, idea driven networks and communities that idea synthesis happens and social mobility accelerates. The networks of trust and cooperation that high social capital catalyzes help to bind together society in myriad ways and thus encourages intercourse rather than creating distinctions, to use English American political philosopher Thomas Paine's words. It is important to recognize that the type of social capital is as important as its quantum, but the former is more a product of state policy than the latter. The degree of economic freedom determines the type of social capital, and the greater the economic freedom, the more likely it is that community is not tied exclusively to social, religious, linguistic, or ethnic identity will emerge. While it is true that the state and society cannot be entirely divorced, the state has to be seen as a separate conceptual entity. For example, having an effective judiciary means that social capital accumulation and business intercourse are more likely to happen across barriers of identity simply because contracts are likely to be respected and hence people need not rely on social censure as a deterrence. More broadly, this confusion between the state and society rears its head when India is spoken of as a Hindu nation. Whenever any politician, intellectual, or public figure says so, there is much outrage and heartburn among a section of the intelligentsia, who wail that secularism is in danger. But these people fail to distinguish between nation and state. Because of India's civilizational ethos, demography, and history, India is already largely a dharmic nation and society. But it follows from the skepticism innate to India's philosophical tradition that the concept of a theocratic Hindu state is illogical. As the Deputy Prime Minister of India at the time, Lal Krishna Advani, said, India is a Hindu Rashtra, but can never become a theocratic state. A Hindu Rashtra and a secular state are virtually synonymous.